I never thought a single phone call could carry so much weight. I remember staring at my screen for hours, thumb hovering over my brother's name, wondering if I'd ever hear from him again. Mum had been gone for barely a week, and already it felt like a wedge had driven itself between us, invisible but heavy, cold and sharp. I had called him 3 times before lunch that Wednesday, leaving messages that grew longer and louder, each one cracking a little more of my composure. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice trembling more than I wanted to admit. "We need to talk. I don't understand." And then, nothing. Silence that wrapped itself around me like a thick fog, suffocating, unrelenting. It wasn't supposed to be this way. My brother, the one who had shared bunk beds, scraped knees and birthday secrets, now turned his back the moment Mom took her last breath. He always said family comes first, that nothing else matters. But the irony cut deeper than any knife. After all the years of shared holidays, whispered prayers before bed, and long summer evenings chasing fireflies in the yard, 1 week was enough to erase me. My calls went unanswered, my texts ignored. And in that silence I started to feel something I never wanted to feel: betrayal. I tried to make sense of it. Maybe he was grieving. Maybe he needed space. But the space stretched on, day after day, and each day it became harder to convince myself that the distance was innocent. I remembered how he used to sit beside me at Mom's kitchen table, laughing at Dad's old stories, sharing secrets he swore no one else would hear. And now, he wouldn't even leave a voicemail. My heart ached in ways I hadn't expected. The apartment felt emptier without Mom's soft humming in the hallway, but it felt colder still without him. One evening, I sat in Mom's favorite chair, the one by the window where sunlight spilled in just right to catch the dust in the air, and I began to think about everything she had done for us. How she had risen before dawn, folding laundry, preparing breakfast, making sure we left the house with enough love and courage to survive the day. And for what? To be left with a brother who didn't return calls, who didn't even send a note, who acted as if Mom's death was a bookmark in his life, rather than the earthquake it was in ours. I felt rage bubbling under the surface, slow and simmering, a fire I hadn't known I carried. And yet I also felt a hollow ache, the kind that doesn't burn but leaves everything duller, quieter, colder. I called a friend that night, someone who had lost a parent years ago, hoping for guidance, hoping for words that would make sense of the senseless. "People handle grief differently," she said softly, her voice calm but carrying weight. "Some withdraw, some act as though the world can't touch them, but the pain doesn't disappear, it hides." I hung up and stared at the phone, turning the words over in my mind. He wasn't cruel, not entirely. He was broken in a way I couldn't see, couldn't reach, and yet that didn't stop the sting, didn't stop the nights when I cried alone, surrounded by Mum's scent lingering in the curtains, wondering if he even remembered how she used to laugh at our terrible singing during family car rides. The next morning I tried again. I dialed his number, waited, listened to the endless ringing, and then the voicemail beep. My throat tightened. I spoke slowly, carefully. "I just wanted to hear your voice. Mom, she loved you so much. I know you're grieving. I want to be here for you. Please call me." And then I hung up before the tears could spill, before the shaky voice could betray how hollow I felt. Hours later, still no call. That silence was no longer grief. It was a wall, a barrier, a statement louder than any words could be. "I don't want you right now." I began to replay our childhood in my mind, sifting through memories for a reason, a sign, anything that could explain why this distance now seemed insurmountable. I remembered how he had always been quick to smile when Mom was around, quick to tease me when we were alone, quick to protect me when someone else got out of line. But over the years, something had shifted. He became quieter, more cautious, more measured. I had noticed it back when Mum was still alive, but never thought much of it. I thought it was just adulthood, just the natural ebb and flow of siblings growing apart. But now, with her gone, the absence felt intentional, deliberate. That Friday, I decided I couldn't wait any longer. I drove to his apartment, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles were white, my mind rehearsing every word, every apology, every question I might ask. I wasn't sure I wanted confrontation, not really. I wanted understanding, recognition, the acknowledgement that Mum's death had shaken both of us and that turning away wasn't the answer. When I knocked, I heard footsteps approaching, and for a moment hope flared in my chest. But the door opened, and it was not hope I saw in his eyes. It was discomfort, a quick glance downward, and then the faintest nod, as if he had simply seen a stranger. "Hey," I said, voice trembling despite my best effort to sound calm. "Can we talk?" He swallowed, looking at me as though he were trying to remember who I was. "Not now," he said finally, closing the door almost immediately. I stood there for a long moment, heart sinking, the echo of the slam reverberating through me. I turned slowly, walking back to my car, each step heavier than the last. That night, I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. I stared at Mum's picture on my nightstand and whispered into the darkness. Why? Why would he do this? Why would he let me disappear? It was the first real night I understood the power of absence. Silence is more than quiet. Silence is a message, a punishment, a reminder that the people you love can vanish in life and still carry on as if nothing happened. I began to think about all the times Mum had been patient with both of us, how she had taught us to forgive, to lean into family when the world tried to pull us apart. And yet, even those lessons couldn't have prepared me for the sting of being ignored, for the weight of seeing my own brother turn his back at the exact moment I needed him most. The next morning, I wrote him a letter, not an angry letter, not a begging letter, but a letter filled with truth. I told him how I felt, how the silence cut deeper than any argument, how Mum's death left us with choices. Either we pulled apart or we held tighter. I left the envelope on my kitchen counter, unsure if I would ever see it again. I didn't mail it. I didn't even text him to say it was there. I wanted it to exist, a marker of my own voice, of my own refusal to disappear quietly. It was a small act, but in that small act was a spark of control, a reclaiming of my narrative in a situation that felt otherwise helpless. And so the days passed. I kept calling. I kept leaving messages. I tried visiting again, but the door remained shut. And in the quiet moments, when the apartment was empty and the city hummed outside my window, I began to plan, not revenge, not bitterness, but a way to bridge the chasm that had opened between us. Something that could shake him awake, make him remember not just Mom, but me, his sister, the one who had shared every secret, every storm, every quiet Sunday morning in pajamas watching cartoons. I wasn't ready to let him go, not yet. I started small. I sent photos of Mum's old albums, pictures of us at birthdays, vacations, silly moments captured forever in faded prints. I wrote notes on the back, memories, little reminders that she had loved both of us equally and that her absence did not mean the end of connection. I waited, hoping for a response. Hours passed, then days, then a week. And still the silence stretched, but I had begun something. The first tiny thread, almost invisible, had been cast across the void, and I clung to that thread like it was a lifeline, a tether back to the brother who had vanished in grief, forgetting that grief doesn't erase love, it just hides it under fear, under shame, under sorrow that is too heavy to carry alone. By the end of that week, I understood something crucial. He wasn't trying to hurt me. He was lost, just as I was. But the difference was, I refused to stay lost. I refused to let absence dictate my worth or my love. And so I began to prepare, in my mind, in my heart, for every conversation, every encounter, every moment he might finally look at me and remember that family is not something that dies with one person, one week, or one letter. Family is memory. Family is history. Family is action, even when it's hard, even when it's painful, and I was ready to act. I didn't know how long it had been since I truly saw him, not as my brother, not as the boy who had once thrown rocks with me by the riverbank, but as someone I barely recognized. When he finally responded, it wasn't a call, not even a message. It was a single, brief note tucked under my apartment door, folded with precision, almost clinical in its delivery. My hands shook as I picked it up. His handwriting, usually so familiar, now seemed foreign, tight, angular, and distant. "I need time," it read. No explanation, no apology, just 3 words that felt like an entire wall closing around me. Time. The word echoed in my mind. Every tick of the clock was a reminder that Mum wasn't coming back, that every day we stayed apart made the distance between us grow wider, more permanent. I thought about how she would have handled it. Mum would have sat both of us down at the kitchen table, poured tea and let us speak until our hearts emptied of grief. She would have reminded us that love isn't fragile, it's stubborn, it fights for survival even when the world feels cold. And I realized that her fight was now mine. I had to reach him, even if he wasn't ready to be reached. I started leaving little reminders of us around his apartment, items that couldn't be ignored. A photo of Mom laughing on the porch, the 2 of us crammed into a single frame at a summer carnival, tickets from a concert we'd gone to years ago. I wasn't trying to corner him, I was trying to speak to him in the language of memory, hoping he'd remember not just Mom, but us, his family, his past, the bond that had once seemed unbreakable. Days passed, each one filled with the hollow ache of waiting, but I refused to let my own grief consume me entirely. I had to act. And then one night something shifted. I received a message on my phone, brief and almost hesitant. "Come over. Just come." It was unsigned, but I knew it was him. My heart pounded so fiercely I thought it might burst. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my coat, the same one Mum had given me years ago, the one she always said made me look like I could take on the world, and I drove over, each red light a drumbeat of anticipation and fear. I didn't know what I'd find when I got there, but I knew I couldn't ignore it, not anymore. When I arrived, the door was cracked open slightly. I knocked softly. No answer. I stepped inside, calling his name, my voice trembling yet steady. The apartment smelled like him, familiar, comforting, and yet foreign in its stillness. I could see the faint glow of the lamp in the living room, and then I noticed him, sitting in the corner, shoulders hunched, head bowed. For a moment, I didn't move, just took him in. The lines of grief etched across his face, the way he seemed smaller, diminished by the weight of what we had both lost. I got your note," I said finally, my voice almost a whisper. He looked up, and I saw the storm in his eyes, the confusion, the anger, the hurt, all mingled together. "I needed time," he muttered, the same words from the note, but heavier now, almost a plea. I sat down across from him, careful to leave space, careful not to crowd him, because I knew this wasn't about confrontation. This was about reaching a part of him that had been buried under grief, a part that still remembered love, still remembered family, still remembered me. We sat in silence for what felt like hours. Neither of us spoke, and yet the room was full of words unspoken, of history, of shared memories pressing against the walls, demanding recognition. I thought about all the times Mum had been our bridge, the glue holding us together. And now, without her, I realized that bridge had to be rebuilt, brick by brick, word by word, until it could hold both of us again. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the first photo I had left for him days ago, the one of Mom on the porch, laughing with us in the background. I placed it on the coffee table. "I thought maybe we could remember together," I said softly. He didn't respond at first. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the photo, tracing the edges with a careful touch, almost as if he were afraid to disturb it. I held my breath, watching, hoping, praying, and then he spoke, voice low, barely audible. I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to be here without her." My chest tightened. I wanted to tell him it was okay, that we could figure it out together, but instead, I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. The warmth of my touch seemed to surprise him, but he didn't pull away. That small connection, that brief contact, was the first step toward breaking down the walls between us. We began to talk, haltingly at first, like 2 strangers learning each other's language again. I asked him about his memories, his pain, the moments he felt lost, and he listened when I spoke of mine. The floodgates opened slowly, words spilling out, tears mingling with laughter, the way it always had when we were children, when grief was softer, less overwhelming. I realized then that this was what Mom would have wanted, not perfection, not immediate healing, but presence. Just being there together, in the quiet and the chaos, letting love fill the spaces grief had hollowed out. That night stretched into hours, and as the city outside continued its indifferent hum, we talked until our throats were raw, until our hands ached from holding on to each other, until the memories of Mom were not just reminders of what we lost, but bridges to what we still had. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of tension, still silences that felt like chasms, but there was movement, a shift, however slight, towards something that resembled hope. I realized that grief is not a wall. It's a river, sometimes wide, sometimes turbulent, but always flowing, always carrying us forward if we are willing to let it. By the time I left his apartment that night, I felt a fragile sense of peace. Not resolution, not total reconciliation, but the recognition that we were both willing to try. That willingness, I understood, was the first step toward healing. The days that followed were filled with cautious calls, tentative texts, small gestures, coffee left at his door, notes tucked under his pillow, shared meals where laughter occasionally broke through the tension. Each act was a thread weaving a fragile tapestry of connection, a testament to the stubbornness of love and memory. I also began to understand the complexity of grief, the way it can isolate, distort, and fracture relationships. But I saw too that love is resilient, adaptable, and persistent. And in seeing my brother again, really seeing him, I realized that absence can be temporary, walls can be dismantled, and silence can be transformed into dialogue. What mattered was presence, the act of showing up, of being willing to engage, even when it hurt, even when it seemed impossible. Weeks passed, and slowly, the apartment that once felt like a tomb of memory began to feel alive again. We revisited old routines, not the same as before, but infused with a new understanding, a deeper empathy. I watched him laugh at something trivial, heard him recount a story with warmth, and I felt the tight knot in my chest loosen just a little. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and for the first time since Mom's death, I allowed myself to believe that our bond, though tested and frayed, could endure. I understood finally that grief doesn't just take, it also teaches. It reveals the strength we didn't know we had, the depth of connection we sometimes forget, the resilience embedded in the simple act of choosing each other day after day. I knew the journey ahead would not be linear, that there would be setbacks, tears, moments of doubt, but I also knew that we had survived the hardest part, the initial fracture, and that surviving together was enough to keep hope alive. The first morning after that night, I woke to the smell of coffee drifting under my door. It was faint, almost imperceptible, yet unmistakable. I didn't need to check. I knew it was him. My stomach tightened with a mixture of relief and anxiety. I had hoped that our conversation had meant something, that it wasn't just a fleeting moment of vulnerability before retreating back into silence. I opened the door cautiously, half expecting him to be gone, half expecting some final gesture of rejection. But there he was, standing in the hallway, a small thermos in hand, a hesitant smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Good morning," he said softly. The words felt awkward, unfamiliar, but there was a warmth behind them, a fragile bridge between what we were and what we used to be. I smiled back, forcing myself to let go of the lingering fear that this, too, might shatter before it truly began. "Morning," I replied. I accepted the coffee, feeling the weight of his gesture, a simple act yet loaded with significance. It was more than a cup of coffee. It was acknowledgement, a silent promise to try, to meet me halfway, to exist in the same space without running from the pain that had consumed us. We drank in silence for a few moments, letting the quiet stretch comfortably between us, like a tent we were both learning to occupy again. Then, almost tentatively, he asked a question I hadn't expected. "Do you ever think about what she would say if she saw us now?" The words were weighted with sorrow and longing, but they also hinted at curiosity, the spark of connection I had been waiting for. I nodded slowly, feeling tears prick at the corners of my eyes. "I do," I admitted. "And I think she'd remind us that love is stronger than our fear, that it survives even the moments we think we've lost it forever." He was silent for a long while, staring down at the thermos in his hands. "I don't know if I can be that strong," he murmured. His voice carried the rawness of grief unfiltered, the vulnerability that had made me ache for him in the weeks of silence. I reached across the small table, placing my hand over his once more, feeling the tremor of hesitation in his fingers before he let go. "You don't have to be," I told him softly. "You just have to be willing to try. That's enough." Over the next few days, our interactions became more routine, small gestures slowly knitting the fabric of our connection back together. We began leaving notes for each other, short sentences of encouragement or reminders of shared memories. One read, "Remember the night we stayed up counting stars? Let's do that again." Another said, "Mum would want us to laugh today, even if it's just a little." Each note was a brick, each message a thread, reinforcing the fragile scaffolding of trust we were rebuilding. Yet, as much as things were improving, there were still moments that threatened to undo us. I noticed the sharpness in his tone when discussing Mom, the way he would retreat into himself during conversations, the subtle distancing that came with grief's persistent shadow. I felt the pull of frustration, but I forced myself to remember that healing is never linear. The contrast between the moments of warmth and the moments of tension reminded me how delicate this process truly was, how easily old wounds could be reopened if we weren't careful, how crucial patience and empathy had become. One afternoon, he called me, voice shaking in a way that broke my heart. I found something of hers," he said, barely above a whisper. "In the attic. Letters, diaries, photos, things I hadn't seen before." I didn't need to ask what it was. I knew that discovering hidden fragments of her life would be both a gift and a burden, a sudden immersion into memories we weren't ready to confront. "Do you want me to come over?" I asked gently, my voice steady despite the surge of emotion. He hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, please." When I arrived, the attic was dim, dust motes dancing in the slivers of sunlight cutting through the small windows. He held a stack of letters tied with a ribbon, the handwriting instantly recognizable. We sat on the floor, knees brushing, as he began reading aloud. The letters were from Mom to a friend, a journal of her thoughts, small confessions, reminders of love and resilience. Listening to her voice, even indirectly, brought a bittersweet mixture of comfort and pain. I saw him tremble as he read, and I realized that grief wasn't something to be fixed. It was something to be honored, a testament to the depth of what we had lost. As the hours passed, we talked about her, not just about the loss, but about her life, her dreams, her humor, her stubbornness. We laughed at the quirks we had forgotten, cried over the moments that felt too raw to hold, and through it all, we rediscovered the bond that had once seemed irreparably fractured. It was a delicate dance, each of us giving space, each of us drawing closer, each of us learning how to exist in shared pain without losing ourselves entirely. That evening, after the attic had been tidied and the letters carefully returned to their box, he turned to me, eyes glistening. "I don't know how to thank you," he whispered. I shook my head, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "You don't need to thank me. You just need to let yourself feel. Let us feel together. That's what matters." The relief in his expression was palpable, a burden lifted, however momentarily, by the recognition that he wasn't alone. Days turned into weeks, and the transformation was subtle but undeniable. We began cooking together, tentative at first, experimenting with old family recipes Mom had once made. The kitchen, which had been silent and lonely, now echoed with laughter, playful arguments over spices, and the rhythm of shared effort. It wasn't just about food. It was about reclaiming life, about asserting that joy could coexist with grief, that memory could nurture rather than suffocate. At night, we would sit in the living room, tracing our fingers over the worn edges of photo albums, sharing stories long forgotten, and discovering new ones in the quiet spaces of our hearts. Each conversation, each shared smile, was a step toward rebuilding trust, toward understanding that absence and silence could be bridges if approached with patience and love. Contrast became our teacher. We learned to appreciate the moments of laughter even more, because we had known the depths of sorrow, to cherish the presence of one another because we had once felt the cold sting of separation. There were still setbacks, of course. One evening, a simple disagreement about a trivial matter escalated into an argument that left both of us fuming and retreating to separate corners of the apartment. But even in those moments, we were learning. Instead of letting the tension fester, we began the practice of talking it through, listening without judgment, apologizing even when it hurt our pride. Slowly, we were learning how to coexist in a world reshaped by grief, how to honor the past while building a present that included each other. Through it all, I realized that healing is not linear. It isn't a straight path from pain to resolution. It is a labyrinth of emotions, a landscape of highs and lows, moments of clarity interspersed with confusion and anger. And yet, within that labyrinth, there is a possibility for connection, for reconnection, for the rebuilding of bonds once thought broken. My brother and I were navigating that labyrinth together, step by step, word by word, gesture by gesture, learning that love can persist even when the world feels impossibly heavy. I began to see his strength in a new light. It wasn't the absence of pain, nor the erasure of grief, but the willingness to face it, to show up every day despite the weight pressing down. And in witnessing that, I discovered my own resilience, the capacity to hold space for someone else's sorrow while tending to my own. The contrast between despair and hope, absence and presence, silence and conversation became a guide, teaching me that the deepest bonds are often forged in the crucible of shared suffering. By the time another month had passed, I could see the subtle transformation in both of us. He laughed more freely, spoke with less hesitation, and allowed himself to reach out in small but meaningful ways. I, in turn, had grown more patient, more empathetic, and more attuned to the delicate rhythms of his emotions. We weren't whole, not entirely, but we were together, and that togetherness, fragile as it was, carried the promise of healing, of reclamation, of love persevering despite everything. The following morning, I woke to an empty apartment, a silence that felt heavier than usual. The coffee I had left brewing was cold, untouched, and the notes we had begun leaving each other were conspicuously absent. A knot formed in my stomach as I tried to decipher the absence, not just physically, but emotionally. Was this retreat another symptom of grief's unpredictable rhythm, or a sign that he was slipping back into the isolation that had haunted us for months? I reminded myself to breathe, to resist the panic that surged with every unanswered question. Grief was never predictable, and neither were the people navigating it. I wandered through the apartment, tracing the paths we had begun to reclaim together, the faint traces of our shared routines now feeling like echoes from another life. The sound of a window rattling in the breeze made me jump, reminding me how sensitive the mind becomes to emptiness after a period of rebuilding. Each room felt like a stage set for a story paused mid-scene, and in that pause, I realized the fragility of progress, how quickly connection can dissolve if left unattended, how delicate the scaffolding of trust really is. Around noon, I heard a hesitant knock at the door. My heart leaped, a mix of hope and anxiety twisting in tandem. When I opened it, he stood there, a bag slung over his shoulder, his eyes avoiding mine for a moment before meeting my gaze with a flicker of apology. I needed to clear my head, he admitted quietly. His voice was tinged with something I couldn't immediately name: remorse, fear, maybe a little of both. I stepped aside, motioning for him to come in. I was worried, I confessed, my voice softer than intended. But I understand. The simple acknowledgement of his need for space seemed to ease a fraction of the tension between us, reminding me that patience wasn't just a gift for him, but a practice we were learning together. We sat on opposite ends of the couch, the silence this time weighted with the potential for dialogue rather than avoidance. I keep thinking about what she would have wanted, he began, and I noticed the tremor in his hands as he clasped them together. And then, I think, maybe I don't really know. His admission hit me harder than expected. We had both spent weeks idealizing her memory, holding it like a map for our grief. But here was the truth. Grief isn't guided by certainty. It's messy, contradictory, and profoundly human. We can't know for sure, I said gently, but we can honor her by being honest, with ourselves and each other. That's what matters. As the conversation unfolded, we began to tackle the harder topics, the arguments we had left unresolved, the moments of resentment that had lingered unspoken, the unhealed cracks in our relationship long before her death. Contrast framed every sentence, the love that had survived years of shared childhood juxtaposed against the bitterness that grief had unearthed. He admitted, finally, that he had shut me out because facing me had been too painful, a mirror reflecting his own helplessness. I confessed that my frustration had sometimes veered into anger, a desperate response to the silence I didn't understand. In speaking aloud the things we had carried in isolation, the weight began to lift incrementally, the oppressive shadows of misunderstanding retreating, however slightly. After hours of conversation, we moved to the kitchen to prepare dinner together, a ritual we had begun slowly reclaiming. Chopping vegetables and stirring sauces felt almost meditative, a grounding act in the midst of emotional turbulence. He laughed unexpectedly at a story about our childhood pet, a small impulsive sound that startled both of us into a shared smile. It was a fleeting moment, yet it carried the significance of proof. Connection was possible, even when shadowed by grief, even when past wounds threatened to reopen. The juxtaposition of laughter and pain made the moment resonate more profoundly, an emblem of the duality we were learning to navigate. As evening descended, we settled into the living room with a stack of photo albums. Each picture sparked conversation, memory, and reflection. Some images made us laugh, others left us teary-eyed, yet the act of sharing them was an affirmation. By recounting stories together, we rebuilt not only our bond, but a shared narrative of our family life. I noticed how he lingered on certain photos, tracing fingers over edges, his eyes softening as memories resurfaced. "I forgot she loved that," he said, voice low. I nodded, realizing that remembering together was a form of healing. It wasn't about erasing pain, it was about integrating it, letting the past coexist with the present in a way that allowed us to move forward without guilt. After hours of heated discussion, we reached a fragile truce. We wouldn't rush understanding or forgiveness. Instead, we would acknowledge the presence of these unresolved emotions and navigate them slowly. Walking through the park the next morning, the memory of our mother lingered in every rustling leaf and sun-dappled path. He admitted quietly that he had been afraid of uncovering more pain than we could handle together. I realized the irony. Our fear of emotional turbulence had nearly kept us from facing it, yet facing it, though painful, was the only way forward. Healing, we discovered, wasn't linear. It was a continuous negotiation between fear and courage, avoidance and acknowledgement. In the following days, he started leaving small notes again, a practice we had begun after Mum's death. Each note contained fragments of thought, half-expressed feelings, or reflections on the letter from Dad. One read, "I don't know if I can forgive, but I want to try for us." Another, "I remember her smile when we laughed like idiots. I need that again." These notes became lifelines, a subtle yet powerful method of communication that reminded us both of the importance of expression, even when words felt inadequate. Contrast framed each note, the lingering pain of past neglect juxtaposed with our determination to rebuild connection. At work, my brother seemed distracted, preoccupied by the resurfacing family dynamics. He missed deadlines, forgot meetings, and occasionally spoke in a low, almost hesitant tone about subjects we hadn't addressed before. I noticed his exhaustion and offered support, but he often waved it off, retreating into silence. I realized that grief, even months later, was a living entity, sometimes quiet, sometimes overwhelming, and it didn't follow schedules or logic. Patience became our mantra, a reminder that emotional reconciliation required time, space, and a willingness to remain present even when discomfort persisted. One night I caught him staring at old photographs on the wall, his eyes misting. I approached quietly, placing a hand on his shoulder. "It's okay to miss her," I whispered. He shook his head, a mixture of shame and vulnerability evident. "I do. but it feels wrong, like I'm betraying the memory of her by feeling anger too. His confession struck a chord. The interplay between love and anger, mourning and frustration, had become a constant internal struggle. We discussed it at length, contrasting the pure affection we felt for Mom with the complex, often contradictory emotions her passing unearthed. Understanding emerged not as absolution, but as acknowledgement, an acceptance that grief is never simple, that love and resentment can coexist without diminishing either. As the weeks progressed, we attempted to reach out to other family members, cautiously reopening channels of communication that had lain dormant. Conversations with cousins, aunts, and uncles were tentative, punctuated by long pauses and hesitant admissions. Yet slowly, bridges formed, built on shared memory and mutual respect rather than assumptions or resentment. Our mother's legacy became a connective thread, allowing us to navigate familial tensions with a newfound awareness. Contrast framed these interactions, the shadow of estrangement juxtaposed against the flickering possibility of connection. During this time, I began noticing subtle changes in him. Smiles that lingered longer, laughter that was less guarded, moments of spontaneous generosity. He returned phone calls promptly, invited me to small outings, and occasionally left me little gifts that reflected his growing attentiveness. Each act reinforced the principle that healing manifests in behavior, not just conversation, and while we were far from complete reconciliation, these gestures were proof that consistent effort could overcome the inertia of isolation, fear, and grief. Then came the unexpected, a confrontation with a lingering secret from our adolescence, something we had never spoken of. I discovered a diary he had kept, pages filled with confessions, regrets, and unspoken fears. The revelation startled me, forcing me to confront memories I had preferred to leave buried. The contrast was undeniable. Here was the brother I thought I knew, layered with hidden emotions and private battles that had shaped his silence and distance. We spoke through the night, unpacking the contents of the diary, parsing truth from memory, and slowly, painstakingly, bridging gaps that years of avoidance had widened. By the time dawn crept over the horizon, we had forged a tentative understanding, a shared commitment to honesty moving forward. One morning, as sunlight streamed through the curtains, he suggested a ritual of remembrance, writing letters to Mom, not for sending, but as a way to articulate feelings we struggled to express aloud. We spent hours at the kitchen table, pens scratching paper, tears flowing freely. Each letter revealed layers of grief, love, frustration, and longing. By contrast, the letters were also filled with gratitude, moments of joy, and reflections on lessons learned. The act itself became cathartic, a means of translating raw emotion into tangible form, allowing us to process complex feelings with clarity and intention. The city around us hummed with life, a stark contrast to the intensity of our private emotional journey. Commuters bustled past, unaware of the delicate navigation of grief unfolding within our apartment walls. Yet this external normalcy highlighted the resilience of human adaptation. Even amidst profound loss, life continued, demanding attention, offering distractions, and occasionally moments of beauty that reminded us of what was worth preserving. We began to step outside more often, walking through neighborhoods, visiting cafes, and sitting in parks where the city's rhythm reminded us that grief need not define our existence entirely. By the end of the section, I realized how far we had come, not to a place of complete resolution, but to a space where communication, vulnerability, and mutual support had replaced isolation, avoidance, and silence. The journey was ongoing, a series of incremental steps, setbacks, and breakthroughs. Contrast framed every moment, the shadow of the past juxtaposed against our determination to reclaim a meaningful present, the pain of absence tempered by the warmth of connection, the tension of unresolved secrets balanced by the tentative trust we were rebuilding. The following week brought a storm we hadn't anticipated. A distant relative, someone Mom had been particularly close to, reached out unexpectedly. Their call carried a mix of curiosity, concern, and subtle judgment, as though they had been silently observing our family's disarray from afar. My brother answered first, his voice polite but stiff, revealing a vulnerability he seldom allowed anyone outside our immediate circle to witness. I listened as he struggled to articulate our situation, grief, distance, attempts at reconciliation, and realized how much emotional labor he had been carrying alone. Contrast framed the moment, his composed exterior hiding the turbulence that had threatened to overwhelm him for months. After the call ended, he slumped into the couch, exhaling sharply. "I can't do this," he muttered. "I can't explain everything, not to them, not like this." I sat beside him, placing a tentative hand on his shoulder, feeling the weight of unspoken truths between us. "You don't have to do it alone," I reminded him gently. And for the first time in months, I sensed a shift, an acknowledgement that reconciliation wasn't a solitary endeavor. Our mother's absence had forced us apart, but perhaps it could also bring us together if we allowed ourselves to be vulnerable enough to accept help and connection. We spent that evening revisiting old photo albums, scanning the images for fragments of memory we had long ignored. Each photograph sparked discussion, laughter, and sometimes tears. I noticed how he lingered on certain pictures. Mom at a family picnic, her smile bright and carefree, him holding a birthday cake as a child, wide-eyed and full of mischief, and one particularly poignant photo of the three of us at a holiday gathering, the kind of image that made the past ache with nostalgia. As we turned page after page, I realized that our grief had created a protective shell around us, but these memories, both joyful and sorrowful, had the power to crack that shell, exposing raw emotion and opening pathways toward understanding. Tensions arose when we stumbled upon a series of letters between our mother and her closest friends, letters we had never read. My brother's hands trembled as he unfolded them, revealing glimpses into Mom's private world, her worries, hopes, and dreams for us that she had never fully voiced aloud. One passage described her concern about how we would handle her passing, a sentiment that hit me with a surprising intensity. It was as if she had left a silent blueprint for healing, a roadmap we had ignored in our initial grief. Contrast framed the moment, the absence of guidance during our worst hours juxtaposed with her written foresight, gently urging us toward connection and empathy. Later that night, as the house settled into quiet, I found him pacing the living room, muttering fragments of thoughts under his breath. "I don't know if I can forgive him," he admitted suddenly, referring to Dad, whose absence had loomed over our lives like an unsolved puzzle. I paused, sensing the depth of his internal conflict. "You don't have to forgive right away," I said softly. "Forgiveness isn't a deadline, it's a choice you make when you're ready." He nodded, though his eyes betrayed the struggle within. The contrast was stark, the longing for closure battling with the anger and pain that had accumulated over decades. In that tension, I recognized the complexity of human emotion, how love, resentment, grief, and hope could coexist without resolution, yet still drive the desire for connection. The next morning, we ventured out to the park again, hoping the fresh air and natural rhythm of life would offer perspective. He spoke candidly about his fears. Fear of rejection, fear of being misunderstood, and even fear of embracing vulnerability after so many years of emotional distance. I listened carefully, offering validation rather than solutions, recognizing that some conversations required space for reflection more than answers. Contrast framed our dialogue, the bustling world around us oblivious to the silent emotional storm we navigated. Yet each step forward in conversation carried enormous significance for our personal healing. Unexpectedly, an old friend of Mom's visited, bringing with her an aura of warmth and nostalgia. She shared stories we had never heard, anecdotes that revealed aspects of Mom's character that had remained hidden to us. One story described Mom's quiet acts of courage during difficult times. Another highlighted her humor even in the face of adversity. As my brother and I listened, I noticed his defenses slowly dissolving. Laughter, tentative at first, began to punctuate our discussions, blending seamlessly with occasional tears. Contrast framed these moments beautifully, the grief and tension that had dominated our lives now interspersed with joy and connection, reminding us that life's complexities often included both pain and delight simultaneously. That evening, he suggested we write letters, not to each other but to Dad, acknowledging the pain, questions, and unresolved emotions that had remained silent for years. I hesitated, unsure if I was ready to confront that part of our past. Yet I agreed. The act of writing became a powerful ritual, a channel for emotions we had buried beneath avoidance. Words flowed in fits and starts, alternating between anger, longing, and tentative understanding. Contrast was ever present, the bitterness of absence juxtaposed with the tentative hope that expression could heal wounds long left unspoken. The process revealed new layers of understanding between us. He admitted, with a vulnerability I had rarely witnessed, that part of his silence after Mum's death had been driven by guilt. Guilt for not having been able to prevent her suffering, guilt for not being emotionally available sooner, and even guilt for moments of resentment he had harbored. I shared my own fears and regrets, and in that exchange I realized that connection demanded not just acknowledgement of shared grief, but also recognition of individual burdens and private struggles. Contrast framed this exchange, our isolation and distance giving way to honesty and openness, a testament to the transformative power of dialogue. In the following days, small victories emerged. He returned calls without hesitation, suggested shared meals, and initiated conversations about memories of Mum we had previously skirted. Each act was subtle yet significant, signaling a shift from defensive isolation to proactive engagement. The city around us continued its relentless pace, indifferent to our private transformations. Yet the contrast between external normalcy and internal emotional evolution emphasized the uniqueness of our journey. We were learning that healing was not a singular event, but a series of deliberate choices, moments of courage interwoven with patience, understanding, and acceptance. One night, as snow began to fall softly outside, we sat by the window sipping tea, reflecting on the week's events. He spoke quietly about how revisiting the past, though painful, had offered clarity. "I never realized how much I needed to face it all," he said. "I thought ignoring it would protect me, but it only made the distance grow." I nodded, feeling the same truth resonate within me. The contrast between avoidance and confrontation, fear and courage, isolation and connection became unmistakably clear. Healing required facing the discomfort, embracing vulnerability, and acknowledging the emotions we had long suppressed. By the end of the week, the atmosphere between us had subtly shifted. While old wounds still existed, they no longer dictated our every interaction. We had begun navigating our grief consciously, with awareness, communication, and shared intention. Contrast framed every step, the lingering shadows of pain juxtaposed with the small yet meaningful gestures of connection that hinted at a brighter path ahead. In those quiet moments, I understood that reconciliation, though ongoing and imperfect, was possible if we remained committed to openness, patience, and love. By the time the following weekend arrived, a strange sense of anticipation had settled over our home. It wasn't the kind of tension that demanded action. It was subtler, like the quiet hum before a storm breaks. My brother and I had established a rhythm, tentative but deliberate, and I could see the weight of unspoken truths slowly lifting from his shoulders. He was more present, more willing to share thoughts he had previously bottled up. I noticed the way he paused before speaking, as if weighing the words carefully, yet the honesty in his voice betrayed no deceit. Contrast had become our teacher. The past was heavy with silence, grief, and misunderstanding, but the present offered dialogue, acknowledgement, and a cautious optimism. That morning, he suggested a walk to the nearby lake, a place we had frequented with Mom when we were children. The lake had always been a sanctuary, a mirror reflecting both the world and ourselves. The path was lined with trees stripped bare for winter, their branches clawing at the sky like the remnants of old struggles. I watched him walk ahead, his posture more relaxed than it had been in months. The crisp air bit at our cheeks, but the silence between us was comfortable rather than oppressive. Contrast framed the scene, the starkness of winter echoing past hardships, the clarity of the present providing space for reflection and healing. As we reached the water's edge, he paused and looked out over the frozen surface. "I think I've been running from everything since she passed," he admitted quietly, his voice nearly swallowed by the wind. I stayed behind him, listening, feeling the rawness of his vulnerability. I avoided her memory, our memories, even my own emotions. I thought pretending everything was fine would make the pain disappear, but it only made it fester. His confession hit me in unexpected ways. For so long, I had felt abandoned in my grief, yet hearing him articulate his struggle made me recognize that his distance wasn't cruelty, it was fear. Contrast framed our relationship, the years of resentment and misunderstanding now softened by empathy, the anger replaced by understanding. We found a bench overlooking the lake and sat down. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small notebook. "I started writing again," he said, offering it to me. The pages were filled with fragments of memory, reflections on Mom, and even letters he hadn't sent. I turned the pages slowly, my eyes lingering on the sentences that revealed his pain, guilt, and longing. It was as though he had finally allowed himself to process what he had denied for so long. Contrast was everywhere, the silence that had once divided us replaced by communication, the emptiness of loss tempered by the power of expression. We spent hours by the lake that day, talking about Mom, our childhood, and the ways we had both struggled to cope with her absence. He told me about regrets he had carried in secret, choices he had made that haunted him, and moments when he had felt utterly alone, despite being surrounded by people. I shared my own experiences, not just as his sister, but as someone who had navigated the depths of grief without his presence. The conversation ebbed and flowed naturally, moments of laughter punctuating deeper reflections, moments of silence allowing us to process emotions too complex for words. Contrast framed the dialogue, the raw pain of loss interwoven with moments of connection and insight, creating a tapestry of shared healing. Later, as we walked back home, we passed the old oak tree in the neighborhood park, the one Mom had always loved for its sprawling branches and the shade it provided in summer. He paused, placing a hand on its trunk. "I never appreciated her patience," he admitted. "She gave so much and never asked for recognition. I think I took that for granted, and it's cost me more than I realized." I nodded, feeling a surge of understanding. The years of miscommunication, avoidance, and resentment could not be erased, but acknowledgement was a crucial step toward repair. Contrast framed the moment, the permanence of loss juxtaposed with the possibility of reconciliation through awareness and intention. That evening, he suggested we cook dinner together, a tradition Mom had always cherished. We gathered ingredients and worked side by side, chopping, stirring, and tasting as we went. The kitchen, once silent and tense, was filled with warmth, the aromas of home-cooked food mingling with laughter and conversation. He admitted he had missed these moments, the simple joys of creating something together, of sharing space and effort without judgment or expectation. Contrast framed our meal, the emptiness that had followed Mom's death replaced by the nourishment of shared labor and presence. As we ate, he spoke about the future, cautiously outlining hopes and tentative plans. "I want to be more present, to make amends where I can," he said. "I don't expect it to be easy, and I know I have a long way to go, but I can't stay in this cycle of avoidance and regret." I listened, heart swelling with cautious optimism. Contrast framed his statement. The shadow of past mistakes weighed against the promise of future growth, the recognition of responsibility balanced by the desire to act with integrity. After dinner, we moved to the living room, settling into our usual spots. The quiet was no longer oppressive, it was reflective, restorative. We spoke about our plans to honor Mom's memory in ways that felt authentic, small gestures, shared traditions, and meaningful acts that would keep her presence alive in our lives. He suggested creating a memory box, a collection of photos, letters, and objects that encapsulated her essence. I agreed, realizing that tangible expressions of remembrance could serve as anchors in our ongoing journey through grief. Contrast framed the activity, the permanence of absence mitigated by the tangible presence of memory, the sorrow of loss softened by deliberate acts of commemoration. In the following days, we worked together to organize Mom's belongings, not as a task to be endured, but as an act of reverence. Each item, her favorite mug, a handwritten recipe, a well-worn journal, became a focal point for storytelling, laughter, and reflection. My brother began to take initiative, suggesting ways to preserve memories while also making space for our own lives. His engagement demonstrated growth, a willingness to embrace responsibility without being consumed by guilt. Contrast framed our efforts, the weight of grief counterbalanced by active participation, the finality of death met with creative preservation of legacy. One afternoon, while sorting through a box of letters, he paused, holding one written by Mom to him when he was a teenager. "I never understood her fully," he admitted, voice cracking. "She was always so patient, so kind, and I was too busy resenting her to see it." I reached out, placing a comforting hand over his. "She knew you were learning, and she loved you anyway," I said softly. Contrast framed the exchange, the past characterized by misunderstanding and missed opportunities juxtaposed with the present acknowledgement of love and the chance to integrate those lessons into our lives. The week culminated in a shared project, planting a small garden in her memory. We worked together, digging, planting, and arranging flowers and herbs that Mom had always loved. The physical labor was grounding, a reminder that life continues even as we navigate sorrow. Each seed planted symbolized intention, each flower a tribute, each moment together a step toward healing. Contrast framed the garden, the fragility of plants echoing our own vulnerability, the growth and renewal embodying hope amidst enduring grief. That night, as we sat on the porch, sipping warm tea and listening to the quiet neighborhood, he spoke again, this time with quiet conviction. "I want to be better," he said simply. "I want to honor Mom by being present, by facing the past honestly, and by building something real between us." I smiled, feeling the first true sense of alignment between our hearts in months. The contrast was striking, the isolation that had defined our mourning replaced by intentional connection, the avoidance of emotions supplanted by courageous engagement. In the days that followed, our relationship continued to evolve. Small acts of communication, shared reflection, and practical cooperation became the norm. He returned calls promptly, participated in family decisions, and engaged in conversations that required honesty and vulnerability. Each step forward reinforced the lesson that reconciliation and understanding are processes, not events, and that the willingness to face discomfort is essential to personal and relational growth. Contrast framed each interaction, the remnants of old resentment balanced by emergent empathy, the lingering pain softened by proactive connection, and the memory of absence mitigated by deliberate presence. Through it all, I realized that grief had been a teacher, not just a burden. It forced us to confront avoidance, neglect, and unspoken emotions, but it also illuminated pathways for connection, growth, and understanding. My brother's willingness to engage, to express vulnerability, and to take responsibility signaled a shift that could not be forced or rushed. Contrast had been the defining element, the tension between past mistakes and present opportunity, between avoidance and engagement, between sorrow and hope. Each choice we made toward reconciliation strengthened the foundation for a healthier, more authentic relationship moving forward. By the end of the week, the lake walk, the shared meals, the letters, and the garden had not erased grief, but they had reshaped it. It was no longer a destructive force dictating our every action. Instead, it had become a catalyst for connection, understanding, and reflection. The contrast between the suffocating isolation of previous months and the deliberate, tender engagement of the present underscored the transformative power of facing difficult truths, nurturing vulnerability, and choosing connection over avoidance. The following morning, sunlight streamed through the windows, casting a golden glow over the living room where we sat quietly. For the first time in months, the space felt alive with calm rather than tension. My brother was reading a book he had borrowed from the library, and I was making a cup of tea. The ordinary nature of the moment, simple, unremarkable to an outsider, was extraordinary to us because it marked a subtle, yet undeniable shift in our relationship. Contrast had become our teacher, The silence that once signaled avoidance now indicated comfort, the physical presence of one another, no longer a source of tension, but a source of grounding. I realized that the grief we had carried together, even when unspoken, had created a foundation upon which something new and resilient could grow. Over breakfast, he spoke about his plans for the weekend, casually mentioning that he wanted to visit Mum's favorite cafe. "I think it'll help me remember her without getting lost in sadness," he said. I smiled, appreciating his intention. His acknowledgement of grief as a companion rather than an enemy marked a significant emotional milestone. The contrast between the past and present could not have been more pronounced. Before, he had avoided anything that reminded him of Mom. Now, he was actively seeking moments that honored her memory while integrating her influence into his ongoing life. We decided to go together, walking through the familiar streets with a quiet sense of purpose. Along the way, he reminisced about childhood memories, the tiny details that had once seemed insignificant, but now held a wealth of emotional resonance. We laughed over stories of clumsy mishaps, celebrated small triumphs, and remembered Mum's characteristic wit. Each anecdote reinforced the bond we were rebuilding, a reminder that memory could serve as a bridge rather than a barrier. Contrast framed our journey, laughter coexisting with reflection, sorrow softened by warmth, absence balanced by shared presence. At the cafe, the atmosphere was comforting. The aroma of coffee, the gentle hum of conversation, and the subtle clatter of cups created a backdrop that invited relaxation. He ordered Mum's favorite pastry, and I chose the drink she always preferred. We sat in a corner, our conversation meandering naturally. He spoke candidly about his fears, his regrets, and the ways he had struggled to process grief in isolation. I listened without judgment, recognizing that his pain had been compounded by fear and misunderstanding, not malice. Contrast was evident. Where once silence had bred distance, dialogue now created intimacy. Where resentment had lingered, empathy now prevailed. After finishing our drinks, we took a slow walk back home, stopping at a small park where Mom had often read under the shade of a large elm tree. My brother knelt to inspect the flowers Mom had planted in past seasons, noticing which ones had survived winter and which had not. "It's like life," he said softly. "Some things endure, some fade, but the effort matters." I nodded, understanding the metaphor not just for the garden, but for our relationship. Contrast had shaped our growth, the persistence of love amidst loss, the cultivation of connection despite past neglect, the recognition that time alone could not heal wounds without intentional action. That evening, we prepared dinner together once again, this time intentionally revisiting some of Mum's recipes. The process was familiar, comforting, and surprisingly therapeutic. We spoke about plans for the coming months, birthdays, family events, and small rituals that would honor Mum's presence while allowing space for joy. He expressed a desire to start a journal, something that could help him track his emotional growth and process memories. I encouraged the idea, noting that the act of writing could provide clarity, release, and insight. Contrast framed the moment, grief acknowledged but not allowed to dominate, memories cherished but not suffocating, responsibility embraced without burden. Later, as night fell, we moved to the living room with blankets and a sense of quiet contentment. The shadows from the dim lamp danced across the walls, mirroring the subtle interplay of light and darkness in our lives. He spoke of forgiveness, not just forgiving others, but forgiving himself. "I spent so long thinking I had failed, Mum," he admitted. "But failing isn't about absence, it's about learning and trying again. I want to be present now, in a way I couldn't before." I listened, heart swelling with a mixture of pride and relief. Contrast was clear, the harsh judgment of the past softened by self-compassion, the finality of loss tempered by renewed commitment.